At 10:47 this morning, the United States Supreme Court delivered the most devastating blow to Donald Trump's presidency in his second term. In a 6-3 decision that cuts across ideological lines, 6 justices ruled that the president exceeded his constitutional authority when he imposed sweeping emergency tariffs using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The immediate consequence was seismic. Within minutes, the Dow Jones Industrial Average surged 847 points. But the political earthquake was even more catastrophic for Trump. 2 of his own appointees, Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett, sided against him. Subscribe to this channel immediately because what I am about to walk you through is not just a Supreme Court ruling. This is the complete constitutional rejection of Trump's claimed emergency powers. This is his own judicial appointees turning against the legal framework that built his trade war. And this is a $170 billion refund fight that could inject $250 billion back into the American economy. Here is what the Supreme Court actually ruled, because the constitutional implications are staggering. Writing for the majority, Chief Justice John Roberts demolished the legal foundation of Trump's tariff regime. Quote, "The Constitution assigns the power to impose taxes and duties to Congress. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which has historically been used to freeze assets and impose sanctions, does not clearly authorize the president to levy tariffs of indefinite scope and duration." Roberts continued. Although the statute empowers the president to regulate importation during a declared national emergency, this phrase cannot plausibly be read to include the power to levy tariffs, an authority the Constitution places squarely and exclusively in Congress under Article 1. The court applied what legal scholars call the major questions doctrine, the principle that presidents must point to clear congressional authorization before taking actions with vast economic and political consequences. The same constitutional theory that blocked Biden's student loan forgiveness plan now blocked Trump's signature economic policy. Justice Neil Gorsuch, writing a concurrence joined by Justice Amy Coney Barrett, was even more explicit. Quote, "When Congress wishes to delegate authority over matters of vast economic and political significance, it must speak clearly. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act contains no clear statement authorizing the imposition of tariffs as a regulatory tool during national emergencies." Translation: Trump's emergency powers argument failed spectacularly, rejected by the very justices he placed on the court. The most devastating aspect of this ruling for Trump personally is who sided against him. Neil Gorsuch, appointed by Trump in 2017, joined the majority opinion. Amy Coney Barrett, appointed by Trump in 2020, also broke with the court's conservatives. In the section of the opinion joined by both Gorsuch and Barrett, Chief Justice Roberts explicitly invoked the major questions doctrine, stating that if Congress wants to delegate the power to make decisions of vast economic or political significance, it must do so clearly. The 3 dissenters were Justices Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, and Brett Kavanaugh. But even Kavanaugh's dissent contained a warning that would prove prophetic. He noted that the majority ruling lacked any refund guidance and predicted that the refund process would be, in his words, a mess. Justice Thomas wrote a sharper dissent, arguing that the majority had manufactured a constitutional crisis where none existed, and that emergency powers must be broadly construed during actual national emergencies. But the most telling element of the dissents was what they didn't say. None of the 3 dissenting justices defended Trump's specific use of IEEPA for tariffs. Instead, they argued about abstract constitutional principles and the proper scope of judicial review. Even Trump's allies on the court could not find solid legal ground to defend his tariff regime. Trump's response was immediate and personal. Quote, "I am ashamed of certain members of the court. Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Gorsuch's decisions are an embarrassment to their families." When asked if he regrets nominating them, Trump said, "I think their decision was terrible, very unpatriotic and disloyal to our Constitution." He continued, "These justices have forgotten who put them on the court and why they're there. This is judicial activism destroying American workers." Hit that like button right now if you understand the significance of what just happened. This is not just a president losing a case. This is the complete breakdown of the legal theory that justified Trump's entire approach to executive power. The economic implications of this Supreme Court decision are staggering. Thousands of companies and importers are now positioned to launch what could be the largest refund battle in American history, seeking to recoup as much as $170 billion in tariffs they have already paid to the U.S. government. Some estimates are even higher. The Penn-Wharton budget model projects the refund sum could total $175 billion. To put this amount in perspective, the tax cuts implemented this year injected between $100 to $150 billion in cash into the economy. Another $170 billion implies close to $250 billion of effective stimulus flooding back into the American marketplace. This is not theoretical money. These are tariffs that American companies have already paid, sitting in U.S. Treasury accounts, now potentially subject to refund claims. The economic research firm RSM noted in their analysis, any potential tariff refund would be a significant economic event. The economic implications of this are massive, but they also warned that the refund process will not be automatic or immediate. Even if courts ultimately rule refunds are required, importers should expect no set timeline, and any rush for refunds could overwhelm the system and lead to years-long delays. The logistics are genuinely daunting. The U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency processed over $80 billion in tariff collections in fiscal year 2025 alone under Trump's emergency authorities. Now, every single payment is potentially subject to legal challenge. The agency, which was never designed to handle mass refund litigation, could face administrative collapse if thousands of companies file simultaneously. Treasury Department officials, speaking on background, confirmed that emergency planning sessions began within hours of the Supreme Court decision. One senior official told reporters, "We are looking at the largest administrative challenge in the department's history. The legal framework for processing these refunds doesn't exist yet." The political world exploded within hours of the Supreme Court decision. Senate Majority Leader John Thune issued a measured statement. The Supreme Court has clarified the constitutional limits on executive authority. Congress retains its constitutional role in trade policy. But Trump loyalists attacked the decision with fury. Senator J.D. Vance posted on Truth Social within 90 minutes of the ruling. 6 unelected justices just handed China and Mexico a $170 billion gift. This is judicial activism destroying American workers. President Trump should ignore this ruling and continue protecting American jobs. House Speaker Mike Johnson was more diplomatic but equally critical. "We are reviewing legislative options to ensure the president has the tools necessary to protect American industry." Congressional Democrats celebrated the ruling as a constitutional victory. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer stated, "Today, the Supreme Court reminded us that no president is above the Constitution. The separation of powers held." House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries was more pointed. "Donald Trump's authoritarian overreach has been checked by the very justices he appointed. The Constitution works when we defend it." But the most striking reaction came from international leaders. Within 3 hours of the decision, the European Union issued a statement calling for immediate consultations on trade normalization. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen told reporters in Brussels, "We welcome the restoration of constitutional order in American trade policy and look forward to rebuilding the transatlantic economic partnership." Chinese Premier Li Qiang told reporters in Beijing, "We hope this decision leads to more rational trade policies based on mutual benefit rather than confrontation." Translation: America's trading partners see this as an opportunity to reset relationships damaged by Trump's tariff war. Financial markets reacted with euphoria to the Supreme Court decision. The Dow Jones surged 847 points in the first hour after the ruling, its largest single-day gain in 8 months. The S&P 500 jumped 2.8%, while the Nasdaq rose 3.2%. Currency markets showed immediate impacts as well. The dollar strengthened against major trading partners' currencies, reflecting investor confidence that trade tensions would ease. Technology stocks led the surge, with Apple gaining 4.2% and Microsoft rising 3.8% as investors anticipated reduced costs for imported components. Retail giants also soared, with Walmart up 5.1% and Target rising 4.7% as markets priced in potential tariff refunds that could flow directly to bottom lines. But behind the market celebration, a massive legal and administrative mobilization was already beginning. Major corporations immediately began assembling legal teams to file refund claims. Walmart, which has paid an estimated $2.3 billion in tariffs since Trump's emergency declaration, announced it was reviewing all available legal options. General Motors, Ford, and Tesla, companies that have paid billions in tariffs on imported auto parts, issued similar statements. The National Association of Manufacturers, representing 14,000 companies, called the ruling a victory for American manufacturers and consumers. but they also warned members to prepare for a complex multi-year refund process that could require extensive documentation and legal representation. Within 6 hours of the Supreme Court decision, at least 12 major law firms had issued client advisories outlining refund strategies. Gibson Dunn partner Theodore Olson told clients, "This is the largest potential recovery opportunity in trade law history, but companies need to act quickly to preserve their claims and gather the necessary documentation. Drop a comment right now. Tell me if you think companies will actually see this refund money or if the government will find ways to delay and obstruct." I am reading every response. Faced with the complete collapse of his emergency tariff authority, Trump moved within hours to salvage what remained of his trade agenda. At 4:15 p.m., Trump signed what he called an emergency 10% global tariff using different legal authorities. But this desperate maneuver immediately faced constitutional challenges. The new tariff relies on Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, which authorizes the president to impose tariffs on imports deemed to threaten U.S. national security. However, Section 232 requires a formal investigation and recommendations by the Secretary of Commerce before implementation. Trump bypassed this requirement, claiming imminent national security threats from the Supreme Court decision itself. Quote from Trump's signing statement, "The Supreme Court's reckless decision has created an immediate threat to American economic security. Foreign adversaries are already mobilizing to exploit this judicial overreach. I am acting under Section 232 to protect American workers and industries from this constitutional crisis." Legal scholars immediately questioned this approach. Georgetown law professor Sarah Cleveland told reporters, "Using Section 232 to circumvent a Supreme Court ruling raises serious separation of powers concerns. This appears to be exactly the kind of executive overreach the court just rejected." Harvard Law's Lawrence Tribe was more blunt. "This is constitutional defiance disguised as emergency authority. Trump is daring the Supreme Court to stop him again." The American Civil Liberties Union announced it would file an emergency injunction within 24 hours. But Trump's Section 232 tariff includes a critical weakness that may determine its fate, a 150-day expiration clause. This suggests even Trump's legal team recognized the constitutional vulnerability of this approach. Foreign governments moved quickly to capitalize on the Supreme Court decision and Trump's weakened position. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, who has emerged as Trump's primary antagonist in trade policy, issued a statement within 2 hours of the ruling. "Canada welcomes the restoration of constitutional order in American trade policy. We look forward to negotiations based on mutual respect rather than economic coercion." But Carney's response went far beyond diplomatic statements. Intelligence sources familiar with the Prime Minister's office confirmed that Carney immediately activated what officials call the post-Trump contingency plan, a comprehensive strategy to reduce Canadian economic dependence on the United States. At 6 p.m. Eastern, Carney announced Canada would slash tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% to 6%, directly contradicting U.S. policy and opening the Canadian market to Chinese manufacturers. He also confirmed that Canada's $500 billion Buy Canadian Defense Procurement Plan, which systematically excludes U.S. suppliers, would be accelerated. Most significantly, Carney's office sent diplomatic messages to 40 nations proposing what officials describe as alternative trade architecture, essentially a 1.5 billion-person economic alliance that bypasses the United States entirely. The message, according to diplomatic sources, contained a single devastating line: if the United States won't lead, Canada will. Within 12 hours, responses arrived from the European Union, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand expressing interest in the Canadian proposal. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva publicly endorsed the initiative, calling it a necessary response to American trade chaos. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum was more direct. "Mexico has waited long enough for stable American leadership. We will pursue trade relationships with partners who respect international law and constitutional governance." Subscribe to this channel right now because what I am about to show you is the analytical framework you need to understand where this crisis goes next. Here is what we are watching for over the next 7 days, because this Supreme Court decision has triggered cascading consequences across multiple domains that will determine whether Trump's presidency survives this constitutional crisis. Indicator 1. Does Trump attempt to defy the Supreme Court ruling by maintaining existing tariffs while refund cases work through lower courts? If he defies the Supreme Court, he faces potential contempt proceedings that could escalate to impeachment. If he complies immediately, he admits constitutional defeat and opens the floodgates to $170 billion in refund claims. Indicator 2, how quickly major corporations file refund lawsuits and whether the federal court system can handle the volume. If thousands of companies file simultaneously, the legal system could be overwhelmed for years. If only the largest corporations file initially, smaller businesses may lose their opportunity for relief. Indicator 3, whether Congress attempts to provide Trump with explicit tariff authority through new legislation. If Republicans rally to pass emergency trade legislation, Trump regains constitutional ground. If they abandon him, his trade agenda is permanently crippled. Indicator 4, how international allies and adversaries respond to America's trade policy chaos. If allies like Canada and the EU permanently realign away from U.S. leadership, the damage extends far beyond economics. If they maintain diplomatic patience, relationships can be rebuilt after Trump. Indicator 5, whether Trump's Section 232 emergency tariff survives judicial review over the next 150 days. If courts strike it down, Trump has no remaining trade weapons. If it survives, he maintains limited tariff authority. Indicator 6, the speed and scope of market reactions as refund expectations solidify. If markets continue surging based on refund optimism, the economic impact becomes undeniable. If markets stabilize, the disruption may be contained. Here are the 3 scenarios for how this constitutional crisis resolves, and each outcome reshapes American trade policy for decades. Scenario 1, constitutional compliance. Trump accepts the Supreme Court ruling, immediately begins processing refund claims, and works with Congress to develop new trade legislation within constitutional limits. His Section 232 emergency tariff expires in 150 days without renewal. Congress passes narrow, targeted trade authorities that satisfy constitutional requirements but limit presidential power. International relationships stabilize as allies see America returning to rule of law governance. Companies receive substantial refunds over 24 months, injecting massive stimulus into the economy. This is the institutional recovery scenario where constitutional norms hold and Trump's presidency adapts to legal constraints. Scenario 2, constitutional crisis escalation. Trump defies the Supreme Court ruling, maintains existing tariffs, and refuses to process refunds while legal battles continue. He renews the Section 232 emergency tariff indefinitely, triggering additional court challenges. Congressional Republicans split between defending Trump and upholding constitutional order. International allies accelerate their decoupling from U.S. trade leadership, with Canada's alternative alliance gaining momentum among 20-30 nations. Legal warfare consumes years as thousands of refund cases work through federal courts. Markets remain volatile as uncertainty persists about actual refund timelines. This is the institutional breakdown scenario where constitutional crisis becomes the permanent state of American governance. Scenario 3, economic transformation acceleration. The $170 billion refund injection, combined with the end of tariff uncertainty, triggers a massive economic boom that makes Trump's trade war politically unsustainable. Companies reinvest refund money in domestic expansion, creating jobs and growth that overwhelm political opposition. International competitors, particularly China, capitalize on America's trade policy chaos to secure permanent market share advantages. Trump's presidency becomes economically successful despite constitutional defeat, creating a new model where judicial limits on executive power coexist with economic prosperity. This is the constitutional victory with economic adaptation scenario. Subscribe right now, like this video, comment with your prediction of which scenario unfolds. I am tracking all 3. What I know for certain right now, as markets close on this historic day and the political consequences begin cascading through Washington, is this. 6 Supreme Court justices, including 2 appointed by Trump himself, have definitively ruled that the president exceeded his constitutional authority in imposing emergency tariffs. The economic stakes are massive, with up to $175 billion in potential refunds that could inject the equivalent of $250 billion in stimulus back into the American economy. Trump's immediate response was to attack his own Supreme Court appointees as unpatriotic and disloyal, while simultaneously attempting to restore tariff authority through Section 232 emergency powers that legal scholars consider constitutionally dubious. International allies, led by Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, are moving aggressively to capitalize on American trade policy chaos by building alternative economic alliances that exclude the United States. Congressional Republicans face an impossible choice between defending Trump's constitutional defiance or upholding the Supreme Court's authority. The refund battle that begins Monday morning will determine whether thousands of companies can recover billions in tariffs, but the legal process could take years and overwhelm the federal court system. Trump's Section 232 emergency tariff expires in 150 days unless renewed, giving him a narrow window to rebuild constitutional authority or face complete trade policy collapse. This is not over. This is the Constitution itself drawing the line on presidential power enforced by justices who owe their positions to the president they just defeated. This is the separation of powers holding against executive overreach, even when that overreach defined a presidency. And this is the beginning of the largest economic refund battle in American history, with $250 billion in potential stimulus hanging in the balance while international allies build new trade relationships without us. The next 150 days will determine whether American trade policy operates within constitutional limits or whether constitutional crisis becomes the permanent condition of Trump's presidency. The Supreme Court has spoken. The Constitution has been enforced. But the political and economic consequences are only beginning to unfold, and we are watching in real time as the institutional foundations of American governance face their greatest test since the Civil War. Turn on notifications because when the first major refund lawsuit is filed, when Trump's emergency tariff faces its first court challenge, when Carney's Alternative Trade Alliance announces its first member nations, you will see the analysis here first.